Sometimes when mastering a song, you can get into a situation where the master sounds good, but it's not quite there. There's nothing wrong with the sound, but it's also not really finished yet. This is a situation where reference tracks can be very useful. They can help finding out where a track sits in the grand scheme of things, and what kind of decisions might make sense from there. And this is also where it's very easy to go wrong. Most reference tracks are not really useful as targets for the sound of a master. This is something that used to confuse me a lot in the beginning. I tried to match the sound of the master I was working with to the reference track, but that was often very frustrating. They probably had different instrumentation, arrangements and mix balances and so on, not to mention that they were likely different songs altogether. So the master would often end up sounding unnatural or overly processed. And this is exactly why EQ matching plugins tend to be very hit and miss, unless the reference track is very similar to the track you are mastering. But there's another way to approach references that is much more useful. This is also the strategy that we have found to give the best results for students when we have been teaching mastering over the years. Instead of thinking of reference tracks as goals, it's often more helpful to think of them as positions on a map. They help you figure out where you are, and once you know your bearings, you can make better decisions about which direction to continue in. And that idea, using references to stay oriented rather than to copy a sound, is a big part of working with intention in mastering, and that's the main point of this video. My name is Thomas and I run this channel together with Sofia, and between us we have 45 years of experience as professional mastering engineers. On this channel we want to share our knowledge and help you make better sounding music. Let's say that you have a mix and you start adding low end. At some point, most listeners will agree that there is way too much bass, and in the other direction there's a point where it clearly sounds too thin. Somewhere in between those extremes, there is a zone where the amount of bass just feels right. The same idea applies to tonal balance in general. The relationship between lows, mids and highs usually have a window of acceptance where it feels natural and intentional. And it doesn't stop there. The amount of saturation or distortion or the amount of compression and density or the stereo width or transient clarity or lack of transient clarity and so on. All of these things tend to have a similar window where most listeners stop noticing the sound itself and can focus on the music instead. And that window isn't fixed, it changes between genres. For example, a metal record can usually have a lot more distortion and density compared to a classical recording. And it also depends a lot on the instrumentation and arrangement. A full rock band, for example, will generally be expected to have more low end than a recording with just vocals and acoustic guitar. So the window of acceptance is always based on the context. And this is where reference tracks become especially useful. When you listen to a lot of music, you start to notice that some records feel very stable. They tend to translate well across systems and rarely draw attention to the sound itself. There's not too much or too little of anything. They are well inside the window of acceptance. These are good to keep as great, neutral references. Other records have a more obvious character. They may be brighter, darker, denser, or more aggressive than the average record in that genre, but they still sound intentional and well made. These records are useful because they show how far you can move in different directions while still staying inside the window of acceptance. I like to think of these as great with character references. Then there are records that are more problematic, tracks that feel too bright or too boomy or too compressed or too distorted or pushed in a way that becomes distracting. And these can also be very useful. They can help define the outer limits of the window, where the processing stops supporting the music and starts being distracting. These tracks can be stored as problematic references. So if you make a habit of collecting songs in this way, you will eventually have a nice collection of references that are useful to you. In my experience, it's better to build your own collection of reference tracks instead of just taking someone else's list. This way, your references will reflect your own taste and be focused on the genres that you care the most about. Taken together, all these reference tracks form a kind of map. They outline the window of acceptance across different aspects of the sound and also across different genres. If a master stays comfortably within that window, most listeners will be able to enjoy the music without being distracted by the sonics. So when you get stuck or need some guidance when mastering, you can compare your master to a few reference tracks that you know sound great. Then you can either get confirmation that you are on the right track, or you can get hints about where to go next. This is a record that I really like the sound of, as well as the music. It's the album New Favorite by Alison Krauss and the Union Station, and it was released in 2001. It sounds very natural, well-balanced, warm, clear, and open. I think of this as a great sounding, neutral reference for acoustic music. This is another favorite of mine, Wildflowers by Tom Petty, released in 1994. This album has some acoustic songs that sound really nice. The sound is more compressed and overall processed compared to the Alison Krauss record. It's quite bright with a more scooped out low mid range, and I think of this as a character record with a lot of high end. In the acoustic genre, these two records map out a sort of neutral territory and a brighter territory. So if I have a track like this example song here, and I wonder if the high end is enough or too much, then I can listen to how it sounds next to these two records. So let's hear how this song sounds next to the neutral sounding Alison Krauss record. For now we will just focus on how the high end sounds. There are differences in instrumentation, but the overall vibe is somewhat similar. And the example track is a bit brighter than the reference, but that might be just fine. Let's compare it to the Tom Petty record. Now it sounds less bright than the reference, so on the brightness map, this example lands somewhere between neutral and bright. The sound is nice and open, but not too bright. It's just about right. If it had been brighter than the bright reference, then there would probably have been too much high end. And when comparing and listening for specific things with the sound in this way, there are two things that I think are extra important. The first is to compare the songs at the same loudness level, and the other is to try to listen to the whole sound without focusing on any details within the mix. I like to switch over to the reference track very briefly, a second or two, just like we did in the examples. That's long enough to get a sense of the overall sound, but short enough to not notice any details. This also happens to be great for showing things in a YouTube video like this and hopefully not triggering any automatic claims for the music. Fingers crossed. Using reference tracks this way doesn't mean that everything has to sound safe or average. It just means that you are aware of where the edges are. And sometimes you may want to move closer to the edge. Some records become classics because they lean into a specific character or push something further than what was common at the time. The key difference here is intention. When you know where the edges of the window are, then you can decide when it makes sense to stay inside it and when to break the rules, so to speak. Reference tracks help make that decision a conscious one rather than something that happens by accident. Finally, a quick note about reference tracks that comes with the project itself. When mastering someone else's music, you will sometimes get a few songs to be used as references. And often these references can be very useful. They give hints about the expectations around overall loudness or density or tonal balance and things like that. But sometimes the reference sounds very different from the track that you are working on. Maybe it's a reference that has been a part of the conversation since the recording or arranging stage, although it doesn't sound like the finished track. In those cases, we find it helpful to listen past things like genre or instrumentation and instead focus on what's underneath. There's often some quality in it that the artist or mixer is responding to, and we might need to ask more questions in order to figure it out. But understanding that intention is usually more useful than trying to match the reference sonically. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.